This is called the realization quadrant, okay? And the idea here is here. So in the quadrant, just to remind you, we always start on the upper right side, okay? The way the clock works, okay? This is the first quadrant, the name fantasy. The second quadrant's name is dream. The third quadrant's name is plan. And the fourth quadrant's name is realization. Just to give you an idea, when we work together, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask me any questions you have. If you write in the chat, I may not see it because I'm always either busy looking at the shared screen or drawing. So I do invite you to rather unmute yourself and say whatever you need to say, okay? Especially if it's a question. And the explanation for this realization is the following, okay? The fantasy is the first impulse we get about any thought, any idea, or rather in this case, let's call it a desire. When a desire enters our mind, it usually comes when we are in the state of fantasy, okay? Children are the ones who can be in that, who get into that state very easily, right? We know there are adults who can get into that state very easily, right? People of artistic nature, right? People who are artists, painters, right? Maybe people who are dancers also, right? Because you need to be in that certain state of fantasy in order to allow your reality to look different, right? What do people who are like painters or artists do? They are able to see beyond their reality. They're able to see into something we call fantasy, right? We call imagination. And that's the idea. The idea is that when we are in a fantasy state, we get an impulse. That impulse is something that we call the desire. If you ever studied the Kabbalistic understanding of this, this is where we get something. There is a term in Kabbalistic idea is called ratzon. Ratzon says it's a desire, but the desire comes from beyond. Okay, the desire comes from somewhere beyond the universe, somewhere beyond our understanding of what reality looks like. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Whenever we want something, right? When we set a goal, it's always something that we don't have in the reality. It's something outside of reality. It may be bound by realistic expectation, but it's always something that we want that we do not have in the realistic state. And that's something, again, the idea for any goal always comes when we are in a fantasy state. And people get in the fantasy state for different reasons, okay? In different ways. Some people only get in the fantasy state when they go to sleep, okay? When we go to sleep, there's a saying that sages say our soul travels. When we dream, it's our soul traveling through various worlds, right? I'm not going to get into like science fiction here and start telling you about, different worlds, but I think we're all here open-minded enough to understand that the world doesn't just stay here, that we're not just living in one reality, that there is no just one scientific explanation, but rather there are different trans worlds that we get to see. Some people get to see more, some people get to see less. But the idea that our soul has the ability to travel to different realities, to different worlds to which we are connected to, and that's important to understand. We will not get to the world that we are not connected to. So during the dream, our soul gets to travel. And there is a connection, okay? So that's why one of the desires, that's why a lot of people, they usually dream either when they go to sleep, right? And we're going to call it dream, even though that's a second, but let's call it fantasy because we're still talking about the first. They either fantasize before they go to sleep or after, because other than that, it's usually realistic world. People work, people do stuff, right? Chores, household, family. And that's the idea that a lot of people get the desire come to them from the outside world. In order to get there, you need to be somewhere out of your reality. And that usually happens either A, when you dream, or B, when you daydream, okay? When I first saw this quadrant, I was wondering, because to me, it was always the opposite. I always thought that dream would be in the first quadrant and fantasy would be here. But the way Pavel explains, he says a fantasy is actually somewhere where you're completely out of the reality, right? When we sometimes see children, when they fantasize, they're like not here, right? But dream is actually something, when you tell a dream, think about it. When you have a dream, and then if you try to tell somebody about the dream, are you able to explain the dream exactly the way you experienced? No, most probably no, because when you explain something to somebody, some idea, some outer of this world idea, you try to put it in words that will be more realistic. And that will bound whatever fantasy you have into realistic boundaries, okay? You will have to find words, right? A lot of times when we dream, things happen beyond the realistic, right? We were able to fly. Some people can able to do things that are like, you're like, I don't even know how to explain this. But once you try to explain it, that's what makes it into a dream. Dream is the fantasy that we try to explain to other people, right? When you try to explain, I dreamt of something, right? It's like that famous joke when the friend goes to another friend, I dreamt of going to Paris again. And she goes, why, you've been to Paris already? And she says, no, but I dreamt it before. And it's hard to understand this, right? But to a person who ever dreamt of being in somewhere where they wanted to be, it makes sense. It makes sense to explain this way because, it's fantasy. In fantasy world, and that's how the soul works, we know, right? You can travel anywhere you want to. But when you try to explain it to people, when you try to put it in realistic words, that's when it turns into a dream. A dream is a fantasy that we put in realistic boundaries, that we try to explain using realistic words, okay? That we try to bring down to my reality, right? And say, okay, this is my fantasy. This is my desire, okay? My desire is, just an example, to travel to Paris, right? Now, when I dream about it, I'm starting to put it in realistic notion and understand, but I've never been to Paris, so I can't say I went to Paris again. And also, what does it mean for me to go to Paris, right? You're putting it in your reality. And that's why in the quadrant, the way the meta-modern quadrant works is that the top is always the past and the future, but the bottom, both parts of the bottom, the second and the third quadrant, is always the reality. It's always bringing down your desire from the first quadrant and saying, I wonder how this will look in my life. How would it be if I go to Paris? How would I be if I open a new business? You take your goal, you take your desire, and you start fitting into your reality. And that will seamlessly, if you pass the second quadrant, not everybody pass, right? Some people say, it sounds like too much of an unrealistic expectation. I don't think I'm going to pursue it. So a lot of people will throw away their goals, their desires right here. But there will be people who will bring it to the third quadrant, and that will be planning. Let's make a plan. Let's put the plan out. Let's figure out, how do I take my goal, figure out how it would fit into my realistic life, into my reality, not yours, because we all have different realities, right? And then how do I take that plan and bring it to the fourth, realization, okay? Realization is the main idea here, because we are all into fantasy, some of us more, some of us less, some of us more into dreaming, some of us have more abilities to do planning, right? Some of us are more structured. But our goal is always to get to the fourth quadrant. Our goal is always to get to the realization, understanding that in order to get to the realization, can we jump from the first quadrant to the fourth? Can we jump from fantasy to realization? It will still be on top. Look what happens. In order to bring the fantasy, the desire into our reality, we must go through the second and the third quadrant. And they're very hard. And here's what our goal for this course is. I want to show you how you can take any goal, any fantasy you have, bring it down to the second quadrant, figure out what's behind that desire. Why do you want that desire? We're actually going to figure out, do you really want it? Is it really yours? Because nowadays, with the bombarding of the social media, right? Used to be before the internet, it was the TV, right? We would watch TV and we would be bombarded by what? Who remembers commercials, right? I don't have any TV. Everything I watch, my kids watch, everything is on the internet, right? And on YouTube, I'm subscribed to premium, so I don't have to watch all those commercials. So sometimes when I get to anything where there is a commercial every 10 minutes, I get so surprised. I'm like, wait a minute, where did this come from? What is this? Even though I know what commercial is, because I lived in the era of TV, but my kids who never lived in it, they're like, huh, right? You can see this with kids the most, right? If your kids ever watch one of those, Disney, not so much, because Disney only showed their own commercial, but if like Nickelodeon or any other children's television, right? They come to you, they run to you. I remember this happened with my nephew recently. He would run it every time there would be a commercial. He would run and say, Dad or Mom, can I get this toy? Right? And you're like, you can easily see how commercial works, right? Nowadays with the internet, the advertising department is very, very sophisticated. You're not